I've drawn a line here with my pen and my ruler. We're going to start with the back stitch. The first few stitches are going to be related to the back stitch, but I think it's good to show you a classic back stitch. For the back stitch, you emerge out of the fabric and you're going to stitch back, and then you travel like so. So then subsequent stitches go like so. So what's going to happen on the front of the work, it's going to look somewhat like a machine stitch. So you can see here the stitches themselves connect. And thread embroidery varies from bead embroidery in that you do what's called scooping. You can actually take two stitches on one pass, whereas in, say, if we were doing this as a bead embroidery stitch, we would actually pass all the way through the fabric like so, and then come up like so. And you could choose to do that if you wished. So this, I'll do one more just so you get the idea. This is the basic back stitch. Very useful. There you have it. The next stitch is called the split stitch, and it's a variation of the back stitch. It's another outlining stitch. These give texture to line. So we begin by stitching down. But then the reason we call it the split stitch is that we come and split the yarn and then stretch forward. Like so. And as I said, it gives you texture to a line, which you don't think is a terribly important thing until you start working on an embroidery project. You don't want all the stitches to look the same, unless you intend for that. When you're working with this particular stitch, you want to make sure that you have a needle that has a little bit more of a point rather than a dull end. How you can tell needlepoint needles is the end is almost round, because with the needlepoint, if you're needlepointing a canvas, you don't want to pierce the fibers of the canvas. But for something like this particular stitch, you want to have a little more point, which will pierce the yarn and the thread that you're working with. Okay then, here we have the split stitch. Now just see, it creates a little different texture than a straight back stitch. The next one in this trio is called the split back stitch. And it has a little different texture. It's made a little differently, but it's still a back stitch, and you're still splitting the thread. So to begin, we come in like so. Then we come up. And then we put the needle in, splitting the previous stitch. And we continue on. So as I'm working, you'll see it gives a very similar look to the previous stitch that we sewed. It's a little easier in my estimation because coming up from underneath and trying to find the middle of the thread to split is a little trickier than coming down from the top. You could scoop this as well, but I've chosen to sew this up and down like this because it's easier when you're learning to kind of get a sense of what this stitch looks like when it's being sewn. These stitches, in my mind, work better if you're working with a fluffier yarn, which is what we're working with here. So this yarn, this would be what's called crewel embroidery yarn. And to my understanding, I'm sure that someone out there will dispute me on this, but the different kinds of embroidery, the stitches are pretty much the same. It's just the different materials that are used determine what it's called. So if you're using fine embroidery threads, it's called something different than if you're using something that has a little more texture. So here we have the split back stitch. So we have the basic back stitch, we have the split stitch, and we have the split back stitch. 3 back stitches. The next 2 stitches are the stem stitch and the outline stitch. They're variations of a theme, and that's why I'm doing them both in one pass. So the lower line, I will demonstrate the stem stitch. The line above will be the outline stitch. They're still back stitches, and it's really the angle of the needle that differentiates them. So for the stem stitch, the angle of the needle points in the opposite direction of travel, but you're angling up like so. These both create the illusion of a twisted cord. That's sort of the look as I see it. But still, technically a back stitch. Now, one thing I'm going to talk about. Your thread, when it gets kind of twisty like this, what you're going to do is twist opposite the direction of the twist, because when you're sewing, you introduce twist just by using your needle. So every now and then, don't feel like you're doing anything wrong. You just spin the needle in the direction opposite the twist, and the twist will come out, and it'll make it a little easier to sew. I will continue and meet you here when I get to the end of the row. Okay, here we are, the stem stitch. Next, I'm going to show you the outline stitch. The outline stitch starts somewhat the same way, but the angle is down, whereas this one, the angle pointed up. This way, we're going to run the needle pointing down. So essentially, if you're thinking of a twisted cord, it's just changing the twist of the cord. So you get the idea. I will sew and come back when I'm finished. And here we are. We have the stem stitch and the outline stitch. The next stitch is called a herringbone stitch. In hand sewing, this would be called a catch stitch, but in embroidery it's done slightly differently, but you get the idea. It's somewhat of a back stitch because the needle is going to point opposite the direction of travel. So on the lower row, I'm going to sew just a single row of herringbone. And you ideally make these even. So as you can see, we're traveling left to right, the needle points towards the left. Just like the classic catch stitch in hand sewing. I'm going to work ahead, and I will meet you back here. And I'm back. I worked 2 rows. One down here is the herringbone stitch, and I worked another row above for our next stitch. The next stitch is called the herringbone double. So how this works is you start another thread, and you cross over and you go underneath. So we're sort of weaving on this one. That's how I like to think about it. It makes a lovely, lovely border. Now I'm using all 6 plies of the embroidery floss. You can do that too. Something to know though about the embroidery floss. When you're using it, be consistent because thread has grain. So you want to make sure that you always thread the needle on the end that comes off the spool first. That way your satin stitch will look consistent. Otherwise, you could get a subtle change in the reflective quality of the thread and you won't get such successful results. I know that seems like splitting hairs, but so I will go off camera to finish this row and I'll meet you back here. Okay, we're almost at the end. Fascinating, huh? I find all this stuff so fun to do. And there we have it. Herringbone stitch, double. Herringbone stitch, and doubled. The next stitch is called the glove stitch. And as an aside, this is a stitch that used to be used to sew the fingers of gloves, just so you know. I have a double row drawn on the fabric, and we emerge here. Then we're going to put the needle in and emerge again right where we started, and then we move over So really how I think about this stitch is you're sewing perpendicular to the two lines. You sew 2 stitches in one place. So here is first stitch and the second. I'll repeat it 2 or 3 more times so you can get a good look at it. Okay, so now I'm going to go off camera and continue. Okay, one more stitch. So that's what the glove stitch looks like flat. So now I'm going to show you what it would look like joining edges. So I've made this little edge here. And you can work it right to left or left to right. So I'm going to anchor the thread here. And oops. So really, it's just you move over, stitch twice. It's kind of hard to do this when you're dodging around a camera, but you get the idea here. And it can be as tiny as you want. So if you have a situation where you need to join a couple of edges like this, this is quite a practical stitch. Now I'm going to go off camera, sew some more, and I'll come back with something that looks a little neater than this. Okay, here I have an example that I've sewn off camera. That's what it looks like if you're holding an edge together. So it's a nice little finish this way, and it's just a beautiful stitch this way, the glove stitch. The next stitch is called the cross and straight stitch combination. So I'm going to start over here. This is a variant of the Glover stitch. This is also something you could sew an edge closed with. So it starts perpendicular, diagonal, and perpendicular. So again, so each unit has 3 stitches. Now I'm going to go off camera, sew some more, and I will be right back. Okay, a couple of more. Again, perpendicular, diagonal, and perpendicular. So there you have cross and straight stitch combination. The next stitch that we're going to be sewing is called the chain stitch. So I've drawn a line here. I'm going to emerge on the line, and then we're going to go back in where you emerged, bring the thread out for the next stitch, and you want the thread to go behind the needle. And you repeat. Now this stitch can be as long as you want or as short as you want. Where I've seen it used in clothing is in bespoke jackets. Sometimes the cuff, if they don't want to actually make a working buttonhole, what they will do instead is to sew a row of the chain stitch to mimic a buttonhole on the cuff. So if you're wondering where can we use this in garments other than decoration, that is considered a use that is commonplace. You see this more in, like I said, bespoke clothing. Okay, so I'm coming to the end here. Now, since this is a chain stitch and it has a great likelihood of unraveling, the last stitch that you sew, to lock it, you just want to stitch down into the fabric like so. There you have the classic chain stitch. The next in the chain stitch series is called the detached chain. And I'll show you the stitch and then I'll show you how to use it for something. So the detached chain really starts like the regular chain. So the thread goes behind the needle. But then you tack this loop down like so. And where it's most effective is making flowers. So each one of these detached chains is a petal in the flower. They all come back to the center, as you can see. They're actually quite lovely. I'm going to go off camera, sew a few more, and I will meet you back here. And here we are, making our last detached chain. And there you have it, the detached chain, second in the series, chain stitch, detached chain. The next stitch is called the alternating chain stitch. For this, we're going to thread 2 threads in one needle, and we're going to tie a knot through both of them. Now, before I get into this stitch, I'd like to talk a little bit about how the embroidery floss comes off of the bundle. When you split it, this is 3 plies. When you split it, it looks like this. It makes it difficult to sew. You notice here everything is nice and smooth. This is because I iron the thread. I know it seems a little finicky, but it just makes your life easier. So, iron the thread. To begin, we're going to start our first stitch and we're going to, instead of putting both of them behind the needle, we're going to put one of them. This is where keeping them split up is a little, there we are. Put one behind the needle, and then you have to be careful with this. Don't go too crazy. Don't start pulling and tugging. And the next stitch, we put the blue one. Now I wish I were the one who figured this out, but I'm not. Someone else smarter than me has figured this out, and we all just get to benefit from that. So every other one we alternate. First the red, and the blue. This one I'm going to let the camera run for a while because it's just fun to watch. Yep. I wish I had invented this, but I didn't. And to finish, sew that back down and secure it. And there you have the alternating chain. So we have our classic chain, detached and alternating. The next stitch is called the feather stitch. To begin, bring the thread up, and then we stitch. Thread passes under the needle, and then we repeat. And then we alternate. So the needle points this way and then this way. I've seen this used in a garment standpoint. I see this used sometimes when they're securing a center back vent on a lining for a couture garment. But you alternate. And you can play with the scale of this if you wish. Make it wider, narrower. But really, the point is that the needle enters the stitches like so. And then to secure for the last stitch, after you've sewn it, sort of like the chain stitch before, you stitch down like that, and that closes it. The feather stitch. Related to the feather stitch is called the fishbone stitch. So to begin the fishbone stitch, you start here, and you're going to stitch to here to get it going. And once you get it going, whereas the feather stitch, the needles went like this, on the fishbone stitch, the needles are going to be pointing outward. So and you overlap ever so slightly. So as you can see, like I said, the needle is pointing out and up as opposed to down and in. Okay, so now I am going to go off camera and sew the rest, and I will meet you back here. Okay, almost done. I think a couple more stitches ought to do it. And the finishing stitch, we're just going to come in here like so. Zoom that in. So the beauty of this is, you see, it looks somewhat braided down the center. So that is called the fishbone stitch. This next stitch is called the stem stitch raised. So what's going to happen is, first off, we're going to draw a little shape, and we're going to lay down some bars of thread. And ultimately, we will cover these with a stem stitch. Just zoom that in for you. But these just lay in. This is going to be the framework. It's very attractive. Say, if you were going to embroider a basket of flowers, this would form the basket. Because I have people ask me, well, what do we use this for? This would be the basket. It would make a rather pretty basket, in my opinion here. So we lay this down, and the configuration of these bars is not carved in stone. You know, just think the vertical, like the warp threads or the warp ribs of a basket. Okay, one more. Okay, so here we have the ribs. I'm going to secure this off camera, and I will meet you back here for the next step. So here we have the bars that we laid down in the last step. So I'm going to come up with the different color, and now this across the row is worked above the fabric. So you catch underneath, and we're heading left to right, the needle points right to left. So what we're really doing is weaving a little piece of fabric on top of our ground fabric. And when we get to the end here, we're going to put the needle in right there, pull this stitch closed, and we're then going to carry the thread over to the other side again and emerge there and repeat. So I'll work a couple of rows and let the camera run so you can enjoy, because these are the kinds of processes that I just kind of nerd out over. You could actually do just a weaving, like a plain weave or other things like that. But this is, I think, a rather nice texture. And I'm going to show one more row, then I'll go off camera and fill the rest of this in. So yeah, row number 3, and you can just tease that down to make sure that everything sits nicely. I'm sure you all watch YouTube and Instagram. In Instagram, there are a lot of little videos on tutorials on these kinds of things. They're fun to watch, and I collect them actually. Okay, so this one I'm going to stitch down here, and then I'm going to go off camera and fill in the rest. I shall return. Okay, I'm back for the final row, which I think is just so charming. Okay, almost done. And there you have it, a raised stem stitch. You could then put your flowers up in here. You have a lovely basket. The next one is called the blanket stitch. So you can see I've drawn a couple of lines. We're going to come out here, and then the thread goes behind the needle. Now this spacing can be close together, it can be further apart. That is really up to you when you're designing, but it works the same. Thread always goes behind the needle, so it creates that little intersection is called the purl, spelled P-U-R-L. So you can use this on the edges of blankets. That's where it came from, as an edge finish. But there are also, you can use it quite close together as a fill. my examples of embroidery. I'll show you that. So blanket stitch, as again you can see, it goes, thread goes behind the needle. I'll sew one more, and then I'll show you how to finish it, because you need to finish this. It's sort of like the chain stitch that way. So when you're finished this, you're going to put the needle in right outside that loop. And there you have it. That is the blanket stitch. Colonial knots and French knots. So I'm going to first sew the French knots with this particular color of floss. And it's the French knot and the colonial knot are just dots. So what it looks like, French knot, loop it over the needle, come in just next to the fabric, and then pull. You want to pull it before you put the needle through. It makes it easier for the knot to form. So this is just little, makes little tiny dots. It's quite effective for centers of flowers. So again, to repeat, I'll repeat this 2 or 3 times. Once you get practice on these, you can sew these very quickly. Okay, one more just for fun. Okay, there you have French knots. Now, the colonial knot. Little different. In my mind, the colonial knot is a figure 8. How can I explain this? You come under and then up and over. Needle in, draw them down. So it's, instead of just one pass over the needle goes under the thread and then up and over the thread. In my mind, I think of it as a figure 8, but that's just me. If there's another way that you can think of to cement it in your head, all is good. So again, under, over, and you don't want to stitch right in the hole, because if you stitch right back in the hole that you came out, you run the risk of the knot falling back through to the back of the fabric. Under and over and in. And again, always draw the knot down along the needle before you pull the needle through to the back. one more, just for fun. You can tell I like this one a little better than the French knot. So, there we have French knots and colonial knots. You can see the French knot's a little finer, a little smaller, colonial knot a little larger, a little more texture. The next stitch we're going to make is called the bullion knot. Now I've put this needle here because you want to use a different kind of needle for this. You can see how this is fairly straight. It doesn't bulge out at the eye like some of the other needles do. This is called a milliner's needle, and they're fairly common. So we're going to be using 2 of these actually. So to begin, I have threaded up my needle with all 6 plies of the embroidery floss, because you're going to need it. So next, I'm going to stitch down, oh, let's just say 1/4 of an inch away, and you're going to pull the thread, but you're not going to pull the loop all the way down. The next step would be bringing the needle up, and before you go any further, you're going to take the other needle and you're going to put it right next to it. Now, the reason for this, in the next step, we're going to be wrapping the needle with the working thread. And having that spacer needle in there is going to give you a little more space so that when you try to pull this stitch closed, you're not going to have a train wreck. So now, let's just say 9 wraps. Okay? And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold it against, it's going to look like that. You're going to hold it against the fabric, and then you want to pull the spacer needle out, and then pull the working thread, and then this will go in there. So that's called a bullion knot. So I will repeat just because, you know, it's good to see another one. So again, come out here and we stitch a distance away, let's just say 1/4 of an inch. Leaving the thread. And now we come here so we have the 2 needles, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So then again, hold both flat against the fabric and push. You're going to take your spacer needle out. Draw that up. And you can sort of tease these a little bit here and there to even them out. So here you have 2 bullion knots. Now, if you know of Ralph Rucci uses the bullion knot and he calls them worms. Bullion knot. The next stitch that we're going to be sewing is sort of a relative of the bullion knot, which is called the cast on stitch. We're going to be starting with 6 plies of the embroidery floss. We're going to be using 2 of the milliner's needles. So how this starts, we start it like we did the bullion knot. Come up and down, and then we're going to come back up again, and then we're going to put in our spacing needle. So here we are. Okay, now how can I show you this effectively? So whereas in the bullion knot you wrapped like so, on here we're going to take our finger and twist and drop that onto the 2 needles. So and you just keep dropping these stitches on for as many as you wish. Now when you're making little flowers, you would put more stitches on the needles than the length of the stitch in the fabric so that the stitch would puff up slightly. But I'm going to sew it flat just so we have it. Okay, so this is what it looks like. I'm going to hold that flat so you can get a good look at that. Let's zoom in on that. And so one more, just now that we're close in, I'm going to put one more stitch on. So you wrap it around and you turn, and that is what you slip onto the needle. So again, like before, you hold all of this against the fabric and you push your needle and pull your spacer needle out. And it's going to look something like this. So now, before I put this into the fabric, I'm going to put that in like so. And see? So let's do another one just because it's so much fun. So again, into the fabric. Bring the needle out. Put the spacer needle in. And then wrap it over like so. If anyone here does knitting, this is what you would do when you're casting on to a knitting needle. Same kind of thing. The little needle spacer is the little piece of information that I was always looking for, and when I figured it out, it just made these stitches much easier to do, because you could just wrap this around the needle, but what you run into sometimes is that traffic jam. Okay, so there, again, one more. And you notice you're going to get a twist on this thread. You can't get by that. That's just what it is. Okay. And so then again, hold that down to the fabric. You can take your needle, tease everything up, and there you have it. We have bullion knots and cast-on stitch. Next, we're sewing the satin stitch. Now, as you can see, I've gone back to my little basket and I've drawn a little flower. The satin stitch is really, it's quite a commonplace stitch, and the object is to fill an area. So you can see here I've drawn the little flower petal, and you want the stitches to be as close together as you possibly can. And when you're sewing a satin stitch, I know people who are heavily into embroidery, and this is terrifically important to them, you want to make sure that the grain of the thread all runs parallel and in the same direction. It's sort of like satin fabric you cut in a nap layout, because there's a subtle change in the sheen. They insist that in satin stitch embroidery, if you're going to do some really nice stuff, that is the case. And I take their word for it, because they do it a lot more than I do. And so here, you can see I'm just filling as close together as possible so that it looks like, well, satin. So now I'm going to go off camera and finish this and come back with the results. Through the magic of technology, you didn't have to sit through all of that. As fun as I think it is, I imagine watching it would be like watching paint dry. Let's see, it makes a nice fill, and it really doesn't take as long as it seems like it would. You just want to make sure that the stitches are as close together as you can get them. I will secure that from behind, and there you have the satin stitch. Now, to finish the center, we're going to move on to what is called the Rhodes stitch. It's a cousin of the satin stitch. The Rhodes stitch is what I'm going to be using to fill in the center, and it's sort of an overlapping satin stitch. But what I like to do first is to give myself some reference marks. Now I'm sewing with 3 plies of the embroidery floss. So I like to have everything divided up into quadrants, because then I'll know how to distribute my stitches. Sounds like the Hells Angels are coming. Okay. So there's that. So really, it is, wow, motorcycles, yeah. Never thought in Union Square, New York. So this we're running clockwise. And so we take one more increment clockwise here, one more increment clockwise there. And so everything sort of crosses over itself in the center. And we can work directly over the stitches that we put in for references. Now I'm going to make you watch all of this because we don't really have that much. It's a very small center of flower. It's not as large as it could be. But it gives it a nice dimension, I think. Okay, almost done. One more and then we're back to where we started. And the stitches sort of stacking up on each other gives a little bit of height to it, pads it out a little bit. So there you have it, rhodes stitch. Isn't that pretty? And here you have it, the satin stitch and the rhodes stitch. Since I showed you the buttonhole stitch on the hankies, I thought it would be fair to show you how to sew it. So we're going to start, made a little mark here. You sew, hold the tail aside, and then you stitch in the same hole. So you're going to have a loop. Now, this is the tricky part. You come up and back to pull the stitch closed. And you're going to work a couple of these stitches over the end of the thread to hide the thread, then you'll trim the thread. So again, stitch, then you can come in, trim the end, and you now have your thread anchored and you can continue. So I'm going to sew a number of these stitches so you can get a sense of what this stitch looks like. Now the object here is to make them as close together as you can possibly get them. This is going to take some practice. Generally, when I am going to be sewing buttonhole stitch, I do practice runs. I like to say it warms up my hands. So the whole key here is coming from underneath this loop. And it's going to make a little, it's called a purl at the top, like when I showed you on the blanket stitch. The purl is a little more complicated. And as you can see here, I'm not doing too well in the uniformity department because I'm dodging a camera and a needle and thread. So let me, could be better. But I'm going to go off camera and work a little more to show you just what this should look like. So you see here, I can actually make it look uniform if I need to. Again, from the back. This takes lots and lots of practice to do well. That's why a lot of these embroideresses from back in the day, because it was usually ladies, did it for years and years and years. But see, there you have the buttonhole stitch. And to finish, you would just run the needle back through 3 or 4 of these end stitches and trim. So there you have it, buttonhole stitch.